Professor Babones, namaste and season's greetings and compliments of the season. I know you are away on a vacation, but thank you for making the time. And because there is a lot that is happening, Professor Babones. So I'm going to first come to the aspect which I have wanted your opinion on for a while. We've just seen two assembly elections concluded, that is Gujarat and Himachal. The MCD polls in Delhi, which are high profile because of Kejriwal versus BJP, etc. Now, do these elections underline what India stands for as a democracy?
Well, they clearly don't undermine what India stands for as a democracy. What's very impressive about those elections is just how competitive they are. If instead of looking at the seat counts, you look at the underlying vote counts, anyone can see that even in Gujarat, Narendra Modi's home state, where if the BJP electoral machine would have any power to crush its opponents, if Narendra Modi as a brand would have any ability to sweep the state, even in Gujarat, the BJP won, I believe, 52.5% of the vote. Now, that in India's electoral system may work out to being a very big majority in the legislature, but it just shows how hyper-competitive India's elections are. I mean, we can see the same sort of thing in Himachal Pradesh, where the Congress was the beneficiary of the same thing, but the other way, which is to say that on just, I believe it was less than a 1% vote margin, Congress scored a sweeping victory in the legislature. And again, that's part and parcel of having first past the post system, where it doesn't take large majorities to generate a big majority in the legislature. But both of these elections really show just how competitive Indian politics really are.
But many in the West have now, developed this coinage, elected autocracy, and they have opined that India is fast becoming one. Would you agree?
Well, I think here you're particularly talking about the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which is branded Indian electoral autocracy. I think they may not know what the word autocracy means. Now, to be fair, they are Swedish, and English may not be their native language, but an autocracy in English has a connotation of absolute power. That is, if you look up any dictionary definition of autocracy, it will always say, or everyone I've seen says, that an autocracy is an environment in which one person wields absolute power. Now, that word electoral autocracy implies that someone is elected to then hold that absolute power, as opposed to getting that power through some other mechanism. But clearly in India, Narendra Modi, for all of his popularity, does not wield absolute power. I mean, if we look at just the number of illegal protests that have been allowed to continue month after month in India, whether that's the protests over the port protests in the south, or whether that's right in the Delhi environs, the protests over the farm protests, the CAA protests, the fact that these went on for months as illegal protests, disrupting not only the public peace, but holding back development projects in some cases, or in other cases, holding back the implementation of public policy, inconveniencing literally millions of people. And the fact that they were able to do that, I'm not criticizing the protesters. I want to be clear. I'm saying that it's clear evidence that Narendra Modi does not wield absolute power in India. Maybe this is a misunderstanding of what absolute power really means. I mean, absolute power means China, Tiananmen Square in 1989, sending in the tanks and clearing the square. No one in India wields that kind of power. Even during the emergency, Indira Gandhi did not wield absolute power. She probably came the closest, but to say that Narendra Modi today is an electoral autocrat is simply to misunderstand the meaning of the term.
Would you also say that this is somewhere also insulting the voter? Because when the voter gives somebody an overwhelming mandate, to call it branded autocracy, is that also insulting the voter?
I don't think it's intended to do so. There are other ways that the democracy rankings have insulted voters by not respecting the verdict of the voters as being primarily what democracy is all about. That said, I think this is really driven by a visceral dislike of to be frank, Narendra Modi and the BJP. Now, I'm certainly no spokesperson for the BJP, nor am I opposed to the BJP. I'm just a neutral international observer who's studying Indian democracy. But this electoral autocracy language seems to imply that the people have elected someone as king, when in fact they've elected someone by a razor-thin margin who is broadly popular and implementing policies that were promised in an election manifesto and are now being implemented in practice. That's really the heart of what democracy is. You go to the polls with a manifesto for what you want to do, and if you're elected, you implement, or at least attempt to implement, the program that you promised to implement. I don't see what the problem is there.
Let's move on to the other larger aspect, and where I want to pick your brains a little bit. Globally, do you believe, and since you're a democracy watcher and you've also opined on what there are other entities like China doing, are we seeing a democracy versus autocracy situation brewing between nations across the world? Is there a tussle? And is China leading the autocrats?
I don't think we're seeing any more conflict between democracies and non-democracies than we've really had at any time in the last 30 years since the fall of the Soviet Union. Of course, things were worse during the Cold War. But today and for the last 30 years, we've had a continual confrontation of one kind or another between the free world and the unfree world. And that confrontation continues. I mean, China is, of course, the biggest, most serious problem in the unfree world, though, of course, most of the Muslim majority countries of the world remain unfree. Their people ruled arbitrarily by leaders over whom they have for whom they have no ability to take out of office, right? So these are the two big challenges to democracy in the world. And I find that my own view on the challenges to the free world seem to be very different from many political scientists. So political scientists seem to understand the biggest challenge to democracy being internal challenges. The fact that people they don't happen to like are running for office. Well, that's par for the course in a democracy. I mean, democracy is all about people with competing visions attempting to attract votes. The real problem we have is that in a static way, and this hasn't changed much in the last 30 years, we have 1.4 billion people in China who are unable to appoint or elect their own leaders. They can't fire their bosses, so to speak. And we have another billion or so people in Muslim majority countries who are unable to fire their leaders. And then we have random other cases. You always have the North Koreas of the world, the Sudans of the world that have democratic problems. But these are the two big centers of anti-democratic, anti-free governance in the world. And they've been with us for, well, not only 30 years, but ever since they became independent countries.
This transgression, Galwan, Taiwan, and then Tawang from China, what would you put a finger on why they would do something like this? And do you believe that democracies should now start taking on China on these transgressions and this hegemonistic behavior?
At a very fundamental level, we don't know why China has been so aggressive. And when I say we, I don't mean me personally. I mean the real China experts, the sinologists whom I read. I don't speak or read Mandarin. I'm not myself a sinologist, but I read a lot of sinologists, and no one seems to know why China has been pushing so hard. There are many theories about that, having to do, some of them that Xi Jinping needs that external enemy in order to cement his place in power. Other theories are that people are in the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, are trying to undermine Xi Jinping by starting conflicts, against the overall direction of the center. And there are a dozen other theories as to why China has been so aggressive. The simple fact is that China is pushing out across its entire southern and eastern frontiers. And I use that word frontiers advisedly. It's not pushing on its internationally recognized borders. Those places where China has internationally recognized borders have been quiet. But the places where its frontiers are undefined, like in India with the line of actual control, where there's not an agreed definition of what the India-China border will ultimately be, or in the South China Sea, where there's not an agreed definition. Well, I mean, there's an international law definition, but not one that China agrees to about where its authority ends. It's in those places. Taiwan is another example of somewhere where it's not quite clear where China's authority ends. In all of these places, China is pushing. And this is not a problem. This is not a China-India problem. It's not a China-Taiwan problem. It's not a China-Vietnam problem. It's not a China-Philippines problem. It's a China problem, right? And it's a problem for the world. Now, can the world do much to help countries? I think countries have to try to help themselves first. So India certainly has taken an aggressive approach to pushing back against Chinese aggression. India will not stand. India is not pushing itself along the line of actual control, but it is not willing to let China push it forward. If we contrast that with the South China Sea, where the literal countries of the South China Sea have allowed China to push forward, well, I don't think there's much that an outside country, like, for example, the United States or Australia, for that matter, can do to help them. That is, if the Philippines, if Vietnam, if Malaysia, if Indonesia were pushing strong against China to maintain their own sovereign territory, they, I think, could expect the help of other democratic countries. But, well, other countries, other countries outside China. But if they're not willing to do so, I'm not sure what the rest of the world can or even should do.
You've made Australia your home. So let me ask you this. Are there people within the intelligentsia, the polity, who are sympathetic to the PLA? Because we see that in India. Quite contrary to what expectations are, there are many who would toe the PLA line. Your thoughts on that?
In Australia, relatively few. There are some, but they're very few in the intelligentsia. In Australia, the main pro-China forces, or I'd say the main groups in Australia who are promoting China's favored policies, let's put it that way. They're not necessarily pro-China regime, but they do promote China's favored policies. These groups are mainly people who depend economically on China. So to some extent, the universities become a problem in our university system in Australia. The mining companies, the big miners, they export enormous amounts of especially iron ore to China, and they are always lobbying for a softer line on China. The intelligentsia in Australia actually has been much more independent-minded. There are some people who advocate that Australia should seek a compromise with China, but I think they're generally doing so out of the feeling that that is what would benefit Australia, not out of not because they're in the pay of China. Now, that's different in poorer countries. I mean, the reason in Australia the intelligentsia is much more independent is that it's very rich, very well funded. They don't rely on Chinese donations or on under the table Chinese money. In poorer countries, even small amounts of money from China can make a difference. And this doesn't have to be corrupt. I mean, I'll give you an example that I've seen in my own world in academia. I've seen a lot of PhD students and even think tank personnel taking positions in China, or taking free trips to China, or getting a degree in China for free, paid for by the Chinese government. And they recognize that the condition of doing so is that they have to speak nicely about China. Now, for an Australian, it's not very attractive. Being offered a free degree at a Shanghai university is not on any Australian think tanker's wish list. But for a think tanker from a poor developing country, that might be a substantial benefit. And that's a lot of how China spreads its influence among the intelligentsia. It's not outright bribery. That may occur also. But it's not primarily outright bribery. It's the favors that can be had by being friendly to China.
Two or three final questions, Professor Babones. One of the aspects is G20 presidency and this year. Do you believe that India can drive a position on the One China policy, use the G20 platform to perhaps mobilize this aspect of moving away from One China policy?
Unfortunately, I think that would be an unrealistic expectation for the G20. First of all, China wouldn't permit it. And China is, without China, there's no G20. But more broadly, it's just not what the G20 does. I'm not sure that it would be in India's interest. That is, if India were to expend substantial political capital at the G20, would regularizing the status of Taiwan be its top priority, I think that's really unlikely. I mean, of course, from a moral standpoint, we'd all like to see our own country standing up for what we believe is right. And I think most people in India believe that it's right that Taiwan be allowed to live in peace. Most people in Australia certainly feel that way. Most people in America feel that way. But it's one thing to take a moral stand as a citizen. It's another thing to expect your government to put that moral stand ahead of other important national interests. I just don't see it happening at the G20.
The recent USIRF report once again put India, a vibrant democracy,
the USIRF report, yes,
as a cause for concern. But the State Department did not do that. They excluded India. What's happening there? You're reading, and I'm sure you're studying those reports.
I am studying it. USCIRF, I use the initials, some people say USIRF, is a highly political body. So I think everyone should understand that this is not some kind of neutral arbiter. This is a highly political body that people in the United States fight hard to get appointed to. Okay, so people who are working on behalf of various groups in America desperately want to get appointed to this so that they can implement their clients or their associates' policies. So as they're working on behalf of other people, whether formally or informally. So it's a political appointee body. It is not a technical body. In the United States, much of that pressure comes from, again, to be very frank, Christian missionary groups. Now, I have nothing. I want to be absolutely clear because I know people take things out of context. I have nothing against Christian missionary groups. But Christian missionary groups in the U.S. do have a strong presence on Capitol Hill. They have very strong lobbying power, and they do influence the composition of USCIRF. Now, at USCIRF, one of the main priorities for Christian missionary groups is opening up India to missionary activity. Now, I know India is already open. India allows missionaries to come. India allows proselytization. I'm aware of that. But they'd like to see more openness. They'd like to see more freedom to act. And, they take the complaints of their people very seriously. So if a Christian in India complains about having a problem, that has a hotline to USCIRF in a way that if, say, a Muslim in India has a problem or a Hindu in India has a problem, that doesn't have a hotline to USCIRF. Now, the bizarre thing is that USCIRF's low rating of India, its vilification of India, has been used then by Muslim groups, and again, international Muslim groups primarily. I'm not talking about Indian Muslims. It's been used by international Muslim groups and U.S. Muslim lobbying bodies to beat up on India. So the irony is that it's complaints from Christian missionaries that are going into a report that overwhelmingly focuses on India's relations with Christian missionaries that is then being generalized by Muslim activist groups to say, you see, we told you that India has a problem with religion. It's really very bizarre to see the chain of custody, so to speak, of those claims. And it has real world effects. So even though it was not picked up by the State Department, I think the State Department is wise enough to know this, but also, again, the State Department's a political body. Even though there are, and I would say the U.S. State Department has historically been, in the India-Pakistan division, has historically been very sympathetic to Pakistan, much less sympathetic to India. And here I'm talking about the professional staff at the State Department. We had that ambassador in Pakistan who made the comment about Kashmir that was, really inappropriate for a diplomat. But the State Department didn't quash that, right? So the State Department is not so much pro-India as the State Department is a political body that has to answer to political masters. And ultimately, the Indian relationship is just too important for the U.S. for the State Department to compromise it on behalf of a small number of missionaries who are complaining. So this is all highly political. If you think about it for a minute, why is it the U.S. government that is raiding the entire world for religious liberty? Well, it's because pressure groups in the U.S. want that raiding. It's not because the U.S. government is a technical body studying freedom of religion.
You've sussed that out beautifully and explained that out beautifully. Come 2023, are you seeing changes in the U.S. also? You believe that the Republicans will take control of the House? You've tweeted to that effect. So since you're talking U.S. politics and U.S. polity, I thought I should ask this question since you're watching. And is that going to set the tone for some interesting times ahead?
Well, here you give me an easy question because Republicans have taken control of the House. I mean, not literally, they won't take office until January, but they've won control of the House of Representatives. And the big change that will make in U.S. politics is that it will open up the system for investigations. In the final 2 years of the Trump administration was investigated relentlessly. Why? Because the Democratic Party controlled the House of Representatives and they could investigate. Now, whatever you think of those investigations, the fact that there were investigations at all only happened because Democrats had control of the machinery of the House of Representatives. Well, now we have a Democratic president and the Republican Party has control of the House of Representatives and will use those mechanisms of investigation to expose any wrongdoing that may be associated with, not only with Joe Biden, but also with more broadly, the political system in the U.S. For 2 years, we've had all quiet, not in the United States, but all quiet in Congress because the party that controlled Congress also controlled the presidency. I'm a big fan of combative politics. We should see our political representatives going to battle with each other, exposing wrongdoing. The way to see what's wrong with the system is to have someone who cares deeply go in and do that investigation for us. So I'm very optimistic as an American, not because I'm a Republican or a Democrat, I'm neither, but I'm optimistic because I want to see as much information coming out of the U.S. government as possible. And with two different parties in control of different houses of Congress, that's going to happen.
Professor Babones, thank you so much for speaking with us. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much.